done an amazing job. You're here. Congratulations. You're learning and you're meeting other folks. The second round of applause that's for the awesome conference organizers that they've brought all of us here today. And the third round of applause is for our awesome speakers. That's going to be the last one, I promise. Awesome. All right. So I'm here to share with all of you on behalf of the Angular team all of the awesome things that we are going to work on and all of the awesome things that we've worked on and are going to be released as part of version 15, which is coming up in November. But before I do that, I want to start with a story. And it's a story about the American Air Force in the 1950s. Pilots were having trouble controlling their aircraft, and incidents were on the rise. And they couldn't understand why, what was happening. So they looked at the skills of the pilots, they looked at the technology, and nothing was really coming up until they looked at the cockpit. And what was interesting about it was that it was created 20 years before that for the average person. But really, who is the average person? When was the last time that you found clothes that fit exactly perfectly because they knew what your size was? What they discovered was that in trying to fit the average person, they really didn't fit anyone. And once they made that discovery, they redesigned the controls in the cockpit so that they're adjustable, so that they meet the unique needs of their pilots. And that really laid the foundation of expanding the Air Force to women and underrepresented folks. And they built a more diverse and inclusive workforce, which was awesome. So you might be wondering, well, Simona, I'm at Angular Day. How does that apply to Angular? And we all know that Angular is a very opinionated framework. And we know that that's one of our strengths, right? We really love that about Angular. But we also know that, like each of those pilots, each single one of you actually has unique needs. And you have a unique set of tools that you love using. You have constraints in your work environment where it might be mandatory to use a certain type of tools. And you have a different set of problems that you need to solve for and a different set of customers that you need to address their needs. So just as the Air Force created those extensible controls, in the same way we're building a framework that has those controls, those custom controls and those extensible knobs, so that each of you can use the framework in a way that it fits exactly your needs. So in other words, we want to meet developers where they are. And there's multiple ways in which we do that. But one of them is by listening. How many of you have filled in the Angular survey last year? Awesome. I see a few hands. The rest of you, you're going to have a new opportunity to do that this year because this is an annual survey. And to our knowledge, this is actually one of the largest front-end surveys out there because we have more than 25,000 people responding to the survey. And it's really one of our biggest inputs for our roadmap going into the next year. So you can see here that there's a couple things that you absolutely love about Angular. You love that it makes you productive. You love that that it helps you to keep up to date with the latest releases as well as tooling and components. Right? Does that resonate? Does that feel like something that you would say if you filled in that survey as well? Awesome. Love it. But there's also opportunities for improvement. So one area that we've heard loud and clear that there's pain points is around debugging and profiling. How many of you have had errors or like it resonates, right? You have to fix a bug or you're just stuck and at some point you give up. You leave your desk, you close your computer, you take a walk on the beautiful Adige because maybe sometimes it is your bug, but some other times it's really the framework that doesn't help you in being productive and debugging and profiling, because your error messages might not be the right ones, or you might not have enough context for that. So over the past few months, the Angular team has collaborated with the Chrome DevTools team to launch improvements to the debugging experience in DevTools. And people from both teams worked together, and the goal was to enable developers to debug and profile their applications in a way that it took the perspective of the author, so that we provide you the relevant context for the code that you authored, and that's familiar to you. And we reflect that in the structure of the files that are being presented to you in DevTools and in the debugging context as well. So when debugging applications using Chrome DevTools, you usually only want to see the code that's relevant to you. You don't want to step into Angular, or you don't want to step into Zone.js, right? Maybe you want to be in the zone, but you don't want to be stepping through Zone.js. And here's an example that I'm sure a lot of you have run into, where you're opening Chrome DevTools and you're searching for a file that you've authored, and you're inundated with all of these other files that you have no context on and you don't care about. And as you can see here, the last file in the list of files is the one that I was actually looking for. So the goal was to make sure that we're, in this dialogue, we're actually presenting you first with the files that you have authored. And to do that, the DevTools team have actually introduced an extension to the source maps that's called Google Ignore List. And this extension is used to identify third-party sources such as framework code and bundler-generated code. And when the framework uses this flag to ignore those third-party files, then you will no longer be presented with those particular files. You can still enable them using settings if you do want to debug through and step through Zone.js or Angular. And what's interesting about this change is that even though the Angular team has worked with the DevTools team to enable this, now that it's available, it's actually available for all other frameworks to use. So if any other web framework wanted to implement this, they could easily do that. In practice, Chrome DevTools can automatically hide code identified in the stack traces, in the sources tree, in the quick find file dialog, and they can also improve stepping through the debugger. So you can see here that another result of this change is that we have more relevant stack traces. So now, as opposed to this previous view where we were looking at the stack trace of this 404, where only one call there was relevant for us, our app component, and the rest were Zone.js and other types of files. Now we have the full context of files that are really part of our application, and they show us where the event happened, where in the code we might be looking. And the other awesome thing is that we also get very good context for asynchronous operations. So this is another API that has been implemented in DevTools, which is called linked stack traces for asynchronous operations. And it allows us to link together both where the asynchronous operation happens. So think about when you click a button, and then that triggers an event, and then maybe you might be making a call to the browser, to the server, and then there's an error. Usually, when that error happens, you only get the context of the operation, the last part of the operation. But now, the DevTools team, together with the Angular team, have basically edited Zone.js so that we can track that asynchronous operation from the moment that you clicked on the button till the actual response. Okay, how many of you are familiar with this error? That makes a lot of sense. We have done a lot of work over the past year to understand what errors folks are running into. This is probably one of the most popular posts on Stack Overflow. Someone even went on Quora and asked what should they do about this error. Someone even posted a GitHub issue saying that, hey, I'm doing this thing and I'm not getting this error. But the idea is that we received a lot of feedback one of the biggest pain points is also error messages, and that sometimes the error messages aren't very clear, they're not very helpful. So the Angular team spent a significant amount of time really understanding what are some of the common errors that folks are encountering. We assign them error messages as well as numbers, as you can see here. We've written like guides to explain why that error is happening, how you might be debugging it, how you might be fixing it. We also partnered with fireship.io to make sure that for the visual learners out there, we also have engaging content that walks you through how to fix that error. And we hope that this will be useful for all of you. How many of you have seen these pages already? Okay, a few. They're also linked in the error stack trace. So if you click, they will take you to some of these guys. Going back to the survey, there's another area of improvement, right? We looked at debugging and profiling, but there's also this other one, testing. And in Angular version 12, we added support for 3 popular end-to-end testing frameworks, Cypress, Nightwatch.io, and WebDriver.io. And Playwright also has a migration guide, but we still had support for Protractor. And at the same time, we started running a request for comments on RFC. How many of you have seen that and they've participated? Okay, awesome. I see a few hands. For all the others, know that the team spends a lot of time in GitHub. And if you do have time and you're interested in kind of understanding what the roadmap is and understanding what the direction of the framework is, we do have a section that's called discussions. And within that section, we usually publish what's called an RFC, request for comment, where whenever we have a new design in discussion, we want to make sure that we take all of your input. So if you have any opinions about standalone components, for example, or strictly typed forms, or testing, that's where you can provide feedback that the team will definitely take into consideration. And that's where you can see what APIs the team is considering. And in this example, we also published a request for comments about Protractor and what should we be doing about Protractor in terms of supporting it or deprecating. Long story short, in version 14, the team has, in collaboration with the community, we've concluded that it's best that we deprecate protractors, and we make sure that we enable really good integrations with other end-to-end frameworks, testing frameworks that would make sense for everyone in the ecosystem. But we also recognize that not everyone might be ready to migrate to off of Protractor immediately. So we have this partnership with Hero Devs, who will be having a public fork of Protractor and maintaining it long term. But we also understand that end-to-end is not the only part of the story, right? There's also, we've heard from folks that unit testing in Angular might be slow. You might be wanting to use other libraries. So going into the next year, we're going to investigate what are some of the challenges with unit testing and how can we improve the experience there. So stay tuned. Do check out the GitHub discussions and provide feedback when we're going to start publishing some RFCs there. We generally hear that you're very excited about native tooling and faster build times, both for your dev environment as well as for your production environment. And for those of you that are not familiar with ESBuild, it's an extremely fast JavaScript bundler that's written in Go, and the team has spent some time analyzing what are the options. Currently, the pipeline that we have in the Angular CLI uses first Webpack to bundle your code. Then it uses ESBuild to apply some code optimizations like function inlining. And then because Cursor takes it is rather slow, we wanted to have this optimization step with ESBuild. And then we have Cursor, which further optimizes your code. So that's a performant pipeline, but there's opportunities for improvement, right? And that's why we're looking at ESBuild, where hopefully with the latest changes and improvements in ESBuild, we're going to be able to reduce that pipeline to only ESBuild. And version 14 introduces an experimental ES build based build system for NG build. Woohoo! And love that. See, this is a cue for applause. I'm going to pause. No? I have appointed Yuri as the chief applause officer. So Yuri, looking at you. On the left-hand side, you can see that I'm running ng build. And this is a Hello World project that I've generated using the Angular CLI. And you can see here that it takes 7.1 seconds to run that build. This is a cold build. Further builds will take a lot less, but this is your cold build. On the other side, on the right-hand side, I have updated the exact same project to use the experimental ES build support. And you can see that the build takes 3.6 seconds. So that's 57% improvements, and that's consistent with our findings that we can get 57% faster cold builds using this experimental builder, which is awesome. And you can enable this today by editing your angular.json file, updating the builder to use browser ESBuild. This feature is currently experimental. The goal is to move it from experimental into developer preview and then into stable. So while we don't recommend that you use this in production, we definitely recommend that you use it maybe on some of your projects, you share feedback with us so that we bring it to a stage where it's actually ready for stable and you can use it in your production environment. One of the things that we're adding in version 15, which is going to be released in November, is also support for watch mode. So now you're going to be able to use this ESBuild-based build system within your local dev environment and have your files refreshed based on that. Okay, shifting gears a bit. Another strong theme that the team is talking about is reducing the learning curve. How many of you have used Angular only in the past year? Okay, that's a lot of hands. That's probably 30–40% of the room. All of you are new to Angular, right? And I'm sure that some of you might have experienced this complexity, might have experienced in your learning journey the fact that Angular tends to have a lot of concepts that you need to learn about and that it might be complex. Those of you that have been using Angular for quite a while, you're the experts. You are definitely familiar with a lot of the framework's evolution, the concepts, and they might be easy to grasp. But for those of you that are coming new into Angular, we want to make sure that we reduce that learning curve. And one way to do that is by reducing the number of concepts that you have to learn as you're just getting started. And as you can see in this Hello World application, in order to get started with even the simplest application, you do need to create a component. You need to understand what decorators are. You need to understand what the selector is. And you also need to create an ng module so that you can declare that component, and then you need to bootstrap that application. And to dive deeper into what does that actually mean, just we can use the hat of someone that is new in their JavaScript journey, new into their Angular journey. And you've just learned about JavaScript modules, and now you're also learning about Angular modules, and you're trying to figure out what's the difference. And as you can see, we even documented that on our website because it's a question that comes up very often from developers early in their journey. Not only that, but the API surface of ng modules is actually quite large, let's say, and it can be complex and it has multiple responsibilities. We all know about the single responsibility, right? Not the case. So here, there's a couple things that ng module is responsible for. First of all, we have compiler configuration that tells the compiler which components are available as part of this ng module, so that they can, when the compiler runs into a selector, then it has to match that component selector to the actual component class. And in order to do that, we use the declarations within ng module. There's also the runtime aspect of it, where the injector configuration is declared as part of the providers array, and we also have composability and grouping of ng modules, where we're bringing them together as part of imports and exports array. And of course, over time, these ng modules also introduces a lot of good practices or patterns for architecting our applications. And over time, we've evolved to think about ng modules in different ways, in different categories, so that we have a shared language as we collaborate across teams and as we think about our code. And these are all good practices and they're good patterns, but we want to also explore what a simplified experience looks like, so that folks don't have to run into this whole world of information as they're getting started. So enter standalone components, directives, and pipes. Thank you. Yuri? Getting started with Angular using standalone components is as simple as writing your component and bootstrapping your application. And if you look at this side by side, there's definitely, like, even the amount of code that you have to write has reduced significantly. And there's even side effects of us introducing the standalone API. Things like now the component becomes the smallest unit of reuse, whereas in the past it was ng modules. So as you were lazy loading parts of your applications using the router, the smallest unit of reuse at that time is usually ng modules. Now you can lazy load your components, which gives you better performance for your users. And as we were rewriting some of the router APIs to add support for standalone, it also enabled us to reduce the size of the router bundle by 11%, which, again, in turn results into better user experience because now you have a smaller bundler. And generally, the goal is not to remove ng modules. We recognize that it has an important place in your applications, and that not all of you will be able to just migrate off from non-ng modules based applications into standalone applications. So the way we build standalone components, directives, and pipes was to make sure that it's backwards compatible and you can adopt it at the pace that makes sense for you and for your organization. So you can see here that you can import ng modules within your standalone components, and you can import standalone components into ng module-based applications. So you can use both of best worlds. Ultimately, our goal is to help you build the best user experience in the world. And really optimizing for the quality of the user experience is key to the long-term success of any website out there. And one way in which we can measure the user experience is using Core Web Vitals. It basically gives you a number to evaluate how are the user experiencing your website. And the metrics that make up Core Web Vitals evolve over time. This is what has been stabilized in 2020. Before that, we had different metrics. They might evolve over the next few years. But currently, the Core Web Vitals focus on 3 aspects of the user experience: loading, interactivity, and visual stability. How many of you are keeping an eye on Core Web Vitals as you're building applications? Awesome. That's probably 30% of the room. If you're building public-facing applications in particular, it's very important that you pay attention to Core Web Vitals because they might impact your application's SEO and discoverability. In the way Google indexes websites, Core Web Vitals might be part of that algorithm, and it determines whether your users can find your website or not. So just diving a bit deeper into these Core Web Vitals, the first one, which refers to loading, is the largest contentful pane. And it's really, what we're measuring here is how long does it take for the largest element on your website to load. And it's when does the user actually figure out whether that page is relevant to them or not. And we have also guidelines in terms of what does it mean to have a good experience, needs improvement, and really bad experience. So the target here is to have up to your LCP, your largest contentful paint element, loads within 2.5 seconds. If that lasts longer, it's a poorer experience for the user. And over the past few years, we've worked with the Aurora team within the Google Chrome team to investigate and improve core web vitals in Angular applications. We recognize that a lot of the Angular applications out there are not meeting the thresholds for core web vitals. And it's easy to say it's the responsibility of the developer to make sure, and the people that are building the application to make sure that they're building applications that meet those thresholds. But the reality is that if we build a framework that has good defaults, then automatically all of the applications will have better core web vitals. So diving a bit deeper into that, what we've discovered is that 71 to 79% of the pages that we analyzed there actually had an LCP element that was an image. So in order to improve LCP for websites, we have to dive deeper into how people are using images into their websites. And there's tons of like best practices and recommendations in order to get images right for your websites. And we incorporated those into what we call the image directive. And there's a couple of things that we're doing with the recently launched or released image directive. First of all, we're lazy loading all of the images except for the largest contentful paint element. And we're prioritizing, we're eagerly loading the LCP image. We've added default configuration for image CDNs. That's another thing that really speeds up your website and your image experience using image CDNs to properly size and optimize your images. And finally, we made sure that you have good guidance through good error messages and warnings that really guide you through some of the common best practices that you should be applying to your images and when you're not respecting those. To update you can update your applications today. If you're on version 14.2, or as we reach version 15, we're going to stabilize the image directive. And in order to use it, you just have to update the SRC attribute to ng-src. And this will basically, out of the box, already give you improvements for your core web vitals. Awesome, thank you. So going back to the user experience, again, we want to continue enable you build great user experiences on the web for everyone. And that's why we're also focusing on enabling best practices for accessibility by default. And one of the recent changes was to streamline managing page title in the router by enabling you to set up the title for your router. And this is particularly important in the context of single page apps when people are navigating using like assistive technology. If we don't change the title of the new route, then they will stay on the original initial page title. So it's important that you update this. And this was a community contribution as well to set the stricter type for route title. If you're interested in contributing to open source and contributing to Angular, know that we have this label that's called Help Wanted, or good first issue. So if you ever want to do that, know that the Angular team is excited to welcome new contributors. And as you can see here, we've had contributions for the router page title. This is another way to configure your page title using a page title strategy that's a bit more involved. We also added support for area parent in router link active. Again, a community contribution from Dario. And this basically allows you to do Usually when you have, let's say, your navigation, you style visually the links that are in your navigation bar, and that's a sign for folks, for sighted users, that hey, this is the active page. And in order to have the same type of signal for users that are blind or hard of sight, then you use area current to indicate that to assistive technology. And lastly, we also have Angular ESLint, and there's plenty of rules there that you can implement for accessibility. And there's another community contribution that basically added support to check that interactive elements are focusable. Another way that we bake in default accessibility best practices is through our Angular material components and CDK. And over the past months, the Angular components team has spent a lot of time to basically migrate to material design components so that we're aligned to the material design spec, and we can easily then migrate to material design 3. So this will be stable in version 15. Not material design 3, but just the migration to align to the spec to material design components. And then we can ease into adding support for material 3. Okay, so those are some of the things that you should get excited about, and you can use today, or you can use starting November in stable versions. We've also added support for strict typed forms, and there's a couple other things that are exciting to see in version 15. Check out the blog post that is coming up, and keep an eye on GitHub. But looking ahead, there's a couple explorations that are top of mind for the team. We're looking at how we can continue to improve our documentation, focusing on the initial learning journey, the usability of the docs, and consistency of presentation of topics. We're also improving, we're looking at improving hydration and server-side rendering. That's something that we know is important to a lot of you that particularly are building public-facing applications. So we want to explore that space and make sure that we're building something that makes sense and is easy to use. And finally, we're exploring reactivity and asking questions like, can we have per component change detection as opposed to top-down, check the entire world, change detection? Can we have zoneless Angular? How would that look like? Can we have computed properties? I know a lot of the work that you do is like tracking derived state, and some of the bugs that are coming up is because of that derived state. Can we have out of the box within primitives in the framework that allow you to do that a lot easier? But most importantly, we're exploring all of these topics with the priority of evolving Angular with stability in mind, and making sure that we're bringing everyone along, and we're not introducing breaking changes without giving you and helping you to migrate. And we also want to continue maintain this property of being an opinionated framework while also including the knobs that developers need in order to fit their exact needs. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Simona. Do you have any kind of question for her?
You can also, I'm going to be here around for lunch and the break, so happy to chat with everyone on the hallway as well.
Yeah, and if you are attending online, just write down on the chat. So okay.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. Like, how does the transition go from the experimental to developer preview to like stable? Like, when should people like? You can always play around with it, but like, when should you try to use those more in production? Or what are the criteria like for moving them across stages?
Yeah, so for experimental, it is definitely features that our APIs are not in any way stable. So you can expect that the APIs for experimental features, might be breaking from one day to another, or maybe from 1 week to another. The cadence for our releases is on a weekly basis on Wednesdays. So we might be introducing breaking changes on a weekly basis for experimental features that are in experimental mode. Then as we move into developer preview, we acknowledge that our APIs are in a much more stable state. We're not anticipating breaking changes unless all of you start using the feature and you give us feedback that, hey, this is not working as expected, and then we have to make a bunch of changes that might be breaking changes. And once we feel good about a particular feature, we're receiving feedback that things are working well, we've tested it thoroughly, then we move it into stable. And once it's in like stable version, it means that we are applying the deprecation policy that's available on our website that says that we're gonna, once something is in stable version, we're gonna first deprecate it if we decide that, hey, this is not the right feature to build, or we want to evolve this feature. First, we have to respect that 1 year that we're not gonna remove this API for the next year, and then we're going to evaluate and potentially remove it. But this gives you plenty of time to adjust to that change. Does that? Thank you for the wonderful question.
So you were talking about standalone components and directives. Should we expect in the future to see more of that and less modules? So, and eventually don't see any more of modules, or it will be it's a side-by-side parallel thing, so we can use both?
So that's a really good question. So it depends what you mean by seeing more of modules or seeing more of standalone, and where that would be. If you look at some of the recent features that the Angular team have worked on, like the image directive and the directive composition API, they're actually based on standalone components. So from the Angular team's perspective, we are going to continue using ng modules where it makes sense, and we're going to make use of standalone components where it makes sense, with this idea of like providing that getting started experience in a much simpler form. In the way that you use the applications, it's definitely up to your organization to decide what are the best practices that you want to implement, what are the architectural guidelines that you want to implement. I think the community is currently and generally in the Angular ecosystem, we're in a place where we are just starting to define what those best practices are, and what those architectural patterns are. Folks like Manfred Steyer are spending a lot of time thinking about that, and of course the Angular team is thinking about that. One of the questions that we have on our minds going like over the next period of time is, should the standalone experience become default? And by default, I mean default in the getting started new types of applications. Or as we build our guides, are we going to talk about the standalone experience and then include ng modules more as advanced use cases? We're still, because this feature is in developer preview, we've heard plenty of really positive feedback from folks that have already started using it, but I think we need a bit more time to learn about how people are using it in production, what types of challenges they're running into, and making sure that before we make this potentially the default experience, we want to make sure that it's in a shape that it really makes sense for it to be there.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. In the presentation, you present the NGSRC for the images.
Yep.
It was related to the LCP for the core web vitals. Do you plan any other improvements for the others, for the other two?
Yeah. So the using the image directive will actually also improve the cumulative layout shift. So it will improve the stability of the page, because as you're using the image directive, Sometimes you might be putting images in your website that are resizing and you're not defining the exact size of the images. The image directive will give you warnings about that and will give you errors. Will say, well, you have to have your size for your image defined. We're also in parallel working with the Aurora team to make sure that we have good defaults, that you don't have to always go into your image component and say width and height is this. So out of the box, we're using the image directive will also improve cumulative layout shift. And we're working with the Aurora team on a new experimental web vital that they are looking at, which is IMP. And that's, so the first input delay measures only the delay from the first input. So it's very limited in terms of what it actually measures from the user experience, only to the first interaction. And what the Aurora team discovered is that it's much more useful to track user interaction throughout an entire session. And the way that they measure that is using the IMP metric. And our team is working with them to kind of understand, for Angular apps, what are the root causes for which the image or the IMP is not very high. Similar to how we looked at LCP, we identified that, hey, images might be the culprit. Let's bake in some good defaults. Now we're looking at IMP, and we're at the stage where we're trying to identify what the image for IMP is. Like, what would be a good thing to fix, and it would give us like a strong impact in addressing that.
Thank you
for
very
the
much,
question.
Simona. Another question? Okay. The last one, because then we need to go on.
Love that we have representation on this side as well.
Thank you. The question is related to the standalone components.
Yeah.
How will the test phase change? I mean, we are going to use still the test bed, or it will be any changes to test the standalone components?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would expect that there would be some changes, and I think the team actually they implemented some changes in the APIs, but it's not something that I looked into very closely, so I can follow up later on.
Okay, so thank you very much, Simona. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.